Good evening, everybody. My name is Chris Lockwood. I'm Director of NEHS and ELA, and as usual, it's a pleasure to welcome ELA, NEHS, Sigma Kappa Delta, and Sigma Tau Delta student members and chapter advisors to this very special webinar with Jesmyn Ward, author of Sing and Buried Sing, one of the NEHS Common Readers, and she is, of course, two-time winner of the National Book Award. Some quick housekeeping notes for you, just to make your viewing experience even more pleasurable. You can click on the full screen button at the top right of your screen. And if you want to react to this evening's discussion, please feel free to do so using the emoji icons at the bottom. Before we kick off, I'd like to say a big thank you to Naaman Kent, Katie Mudd, and Jessica McCall, who have worked behind the scenes to make sure this webinar is a great success. So thank you, Naaman, thank you, Katie, thank you, Jessica. And some other information for you. So due to some scheduling limitations, this webinar had to be recorded. Those same reasons as some medical issues mean that our intended interviewers were unable to participate. Thus, tonight's interviewer needs no introduction because it's me. And because we had such a quick turnaround on this, and because the normal preparation time wasn't available to us, the webinar might seem a little less prepared and a little less polished than normal. But Jesmyn's responses to your questions are definitely excellent and worth engaging with. So Jesmyn Ward has received the MacArthur Genius Grant, a Stegner Fellowship, and a John and Renee Grisham Writers Residency, the Strauss Living Prize, and the 2022 Library of Congress Prize for American Fiction. She is the historic winner, the first woman and the first Black American of 2 National Book Awards for fiction, one for Sing and Buried Sing in 2017, and one for Salvage the Bones in 2011. She's also the author of the novel Where the Line Bleeds and the memoir Men We Reaped, which was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award and won the Chicago Tribune Heartland Prize. Jesmyn is a great person, a very thoughtful responder to your questions, and someone who has a series of incredibly interesting projects on the horizon, which she will explain. So sit back and enjoy the webinar. Okay, so Chante Primus from Arkansas and Isabella Phillips and Vanessa Harshaw from North Carolina ask you, Jesmyn, what is one genre or one book that you love to read and why? What authors inspire you?
Well, I read a fair amount of literary fiction because I write literary fiction, and I think that that reading literary fiction helps me to understand how I want to write, and what kind of prose I want to use. So all the greats of literary fiction inspire me, like Toni Morrison and Alice Walker and William Faulkner and Kiese Layman. I love his work. I also read a lot of poetry because I feel like poetry teaches me a lot of things about like the power of language, and how to be intentional about the kind of figurative language that I'm using and the rhythm of the sentences, and how you should just be mindful of those things even when you're writing prose. And so I love poets like Jericho Brown and Ada Limon, Natasha Trethewey, but I read widely. Like I read specifically in those 2 genres because it helps me to do the kind of writing that I do. But I also I love to read sci-fi. I love to read fantasy. I love to read YA books. One of the most recent YA books that I read was a book called Ring Shout by P. Jelly Clark. I think I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly, but it was fantastic. It was fantastic. It's hard for me to explain because the book itself is so it's sort of set in the early 1900s. There are some I guess racial violence in it, right? But at the same time, it's there's some there are magical elements to it. And it was fantastic. It was like so creative. I loved it. So, and even though like those genres are sort of removed from the genre that I write in, I think that the fact that I read those genres, I think that they probably do have some influence on me, in my writing, but I don't it's hard for me to put into words exactly how they influence me.
Right, absolutely. Those are great novel recommendations as well. I'll
Mm.
be adding them to my never ending to be read
Yes.
list. But it's and your comments there sort of lead on to the next question, which comes from
Mhm.
Eric Robertson and Evan Sharp in North Carolina and Emily
Mhm.
Noakes in Texas. And they ask, what inspires you to write? And what is the most difficult part of the writing that you do?
Mm. I think 2 things inspire me to write. I think the first thing that inspires me to write is the the people around me, right? So, people so the people in my family, the people in my extended family, the people in my community. I think the reason that they inspire me to write is because I was a reader before I was a writer, right? And I grew up in the late 1980s, early 1990s, right? Um, and back then, I loved books. I loved storytelling. I love, sort of immersing myself in different worlds with different characters. But it was noticeable to me that I didn't see myself or the people around me in the stories that I read. We weren't there. And so part I think that that inspired me to write about myself and about, the people around me, right? Because I wanted to see us sort of living on the page, right?
Right.
I also think that uh place inspires me. Um, I know I know that generally when people talk about Mississippi, it's not good, right? I mean, and people ask me a lot, like, why did you just decide to return? Why is this someplace that you're living when you could live anywhere else in the world, right? Um, and one of the reasons that I return to this place and that I write about this place and that this place inspires me is because it's just beautiful and it's beautiful. And I think just the natural landscape, the bayous, the forests, the gulf, the just everything. It speaks to me, and I like to incorporate it. I don't know. I want to make it real on the page. I want to render it on the page or write a version of it on the page because I think it's so beautiful.
Yeah, and it is beautiful. I mean, I lived on that coast, the southern US coast, for a long time. I lived in New Orleans, so I
Mhm.
know about the sort of
Yeah,
Louisiana landscapes, and they are absolutely beautiful. And what you
Mhm.
what you said there about representing the people from your community, your sort of friends, family. Um, do you write for one particular person? We know that Stephen King, and this is a question from April Quevedo in Maryland. Stephen King says that he writes for one specific person.
Mm.
We assume Mrs. King.
Mhm.
Um, do you have a particular reader in mind when you're writing? Is it your friends and family? Is it the people from your community, or is it a bigger, wider audience?
Mm. I don't think that I write for one particular person. I think honestly, I try to avoid thinking about audience and readers when I write. And I know that sounds strange, um, but I think and I know it's different for all writers don't feel this way, right? But me particularly, it's easier for me to sink into the world that I'm writing about with the character and write that the story if I can sort of forget, if I can forget what I'm doing. I know that doesn't make sense, but like, uh, when you're sitting down, or when I'm sitting down, and when I'm working on a rough draft, I always, around 20 pages in to the rough draft, it's almost like I forget that I'm doing the work, right? One part of my brain knows that I'm doing all of this, right? That I'm writing, that I'm making this up, that I'm making all the decisions. But most of me uh, feels like the person, like I'm not telling this story. Like there's like the person, the character, right? The main character is sitting next to me just beyond my eyesight, and they're telling me the story. Um, so in a way, this is gonna sound strange. In a way, it's almost like I feel like you should ask them that that question, right?
Right.
Like, what, like, who does Esh, want to read her story? Who does Annis want to read her story? Who does Jojo want to, like, who does he want to tell his story to? Because I don't know. Yeah, I try not to think about audience or the reader, and not necessarily because, not because I, there's an arrogance there, or I'm being rude. I think, one, it's easier for me to create when I don't think about the audience, and two, I think that uh if you think about the audience as like a group, it's not just one person, right? Like, I think it's a really smart thing that Stephen King does. He writes for one person, because I feel like when you think about the audience as a collection of people, that you can feel a certain amount of stress, right? Because you're constantly worried about what people want. What do the majority of people want? What do they expect? Do they want a story like this? Do they want a story like that? Do they, and sometimes your concerns about what they want, right? Like, you might think they want one type of story. Well, what if the type of story you think they want is not the story that you're writing, right? Or I don't know. So that kind of worry can become overwhelming. And I think that can stifle your creative process, or at least with me, that's
Right.
how it goes.
Do you worry about your characters when you close your computer there, you put down your pen and you go away and do something
Mhm.
else at the end of the day? Do you worry about the characters? When you were writing Singing Bracing, did you take that emotional load on board, and like think, oh, Jojo is vulnerable and afraid, and I'm
Mhm. Mhm.
afraid and vulnerable for him?
Yeah.
Does that happen for you?
I do. I think about them often, to the point that, when I'm working on the book, and I do my, 2 to 4 hours a day or whatever, and then I have to do whatever in real life, take care of my kids or whatever. I do find myself thinking about them and wondering what will happen next. What will happen when I return to the page. In nearly every book that I've written, so all the novels and the memoir, when I get to the end of the rough draft, like when I write the final words of the first draft, I always cry, because it's sad to me, because it feels like, because I've spent so much time with the people that I've been writing about, and writing those last words and ending that rough draft means that, I don't know, that it's a sort of separation away, right? Like, I'm not gonna spend that kind of time with these people anymore, right? So yeah, I do. I think about them. I worry about them. When I was writing Sing and Berry Sing, I felt very protective of Jojo. I felt protective of Richie, and I felt very sad for Richie, especially near the end of the book. Um, Once I got over being a little judgmental of Leonie when in the like very on in that first draft. Um, uh, then I think I felt for her. You know, I was sad for her because I could see that she knew that she was failing as a caregiver. You know, she was failing her son, you know, as a mother, and but she couldn't do any better, you know, for multiple reasons, right? So yeah, so I don't know. I think, and that's just in Seeing Unburied Things, and that happens with every book, right? I think part of the reason that you do feel that, or that I do feel for my characters, is because I love them, and part of the reason that I love them is because they are sort of fictional, uh, fictional members of my community, fictional members of my extended family. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
Because that's the kind of people that I write about.
absolutely. And do you feel the same separation, an emotional separation, when you send your draft off to the publisher as you do when you
Hmm.
finish the first draft, or have you sort of is it a bit more of a sort of colder, less emotional process once you've got that first draft down?
I think I think once I send that final draft off, you know, or the later drafts, I think I feel a bit more separated from them because I
Right.
think because by that point, right? Like, I mean, by the time I send it off to my editor, I'm 12 drafts in, right? So at that point, you know, I feel like that's when I finally start, you know, when I'm that many drafts in, that's when I finally start thinking a little bit about audience, right? Because I wonder how the audience will receive those characters, what they'll think about them, whether or not they'll love them, you know. Um, so yeah, but it's a little less, I think, shocking uh,
Hmm.
because I guess I've uh, become accustomed to the idea that
Right.
the characters will not just be mine anymore, right? You know, as they make their way out in the world in the book, the readers will take them on and they'll belong to the readers.
No, absolutely. That makes perfect sense. That question came out of answer Rodriguez in Mexico about 10 minutes. That question I asked about 10 minutes ago. Then I asked several more questions afterwards. Sorry, that one. But it leads on quite nicely to a question from Robin Orgney in Oregon, who says, "Well, how do you maintain your passion, your motivation, and your inspiration for
Mhm.
these characters when you have to sit down and work with them for such a long time?
Mm.
And how does that passion and love for those characters, does it sort of wax and wane as you get
Hmm.
to more of a sort of publishing editing process as
Hmm.
opposed to writing that first draft?"
No, I think the emotion that I feel for them remains the same throughout. Because I think that what happens is that early on in that first draft, they become real people to me,
Mhm.
right? I mean, they become real people to me. And I know it sounds strange, but when I'm writing that rough draft, the characters will surprise me. They'll say things that surprise me. They'll do things that I did not expect them to do. They'll act in ways that you know, that will, you know, I don't know, shock me. They will surprise me. And so, and I think that part of the reason that that happens is because they become real to me. Um, and so that, and once they're real to me, uh, you know, I love them. Um, you know, I might I guess that love is uh is tailored to who they are as people in a way, I guess.
Right.
Um so like I was saying earlier, like I love Leonie, right? Jojo's mom, right? Jojo's abusive um mom who is struggling with substance abuse, right? and I love her, and I also am aware of her faults, right? I'm also aware of, like, places of the fact that she's, like, hurting JoJo, that she is that the actions that she's taking, that they're gonna have, so there are repercussions in the present for her children, and there will be more repercussions in the future. Um, that she's marking them in many ways, and they'll carry those wounds with them into their teenage years and into their young adulthood. Um, and so that means that the love that I feel for a character like her, like, it's complicated, but it doesn't wane or it doesn't go away. It's just, I guess, informed by who she is as a person.
Right. And how did you know that, when you had that germ of an idea, that first moment of realization, oh, this I have this idea for Sing and Buried Sing, or what
Mhm.
became Sing and Buried Sing. How do you know that that was worth pursuing? Was there a moment you thought, yes, this is it. I got it, and I'm going with it.
I think that I doubt the the worth of my stories until, uh, probably well into, like, them actually being published, right? Like, the books are out in the world, and I'm still wondering whether or not I'm still wondering what the reception will be. I guess, okay, so maybe my answer is, I feel like it's hitting on a different thing, right? Because personally, for me, when I am telling the stories, I never doubt the worth of the stories, right? From the first moment that I'm putting a word down on the page, like, that's the whole reason that I'm writing the story, is because I believe in its worth. I believe that it's worth telling. Uh, but I guess the thing that I worry about is whether or not the audience will agree. um, yeah, whether or not the audience will agree.
And
Uh, mhm.
sorry, but do you worry about what the critics say? 'Cause, you said that you love these characters. You've created these
Yeah.
people. They stick with you while you're writing. Are
Mhm.
you able to separate the sort of the critic's opinion from your love for these characters? Is that even possible?
I don't read reviews.
Right.
I will only read reviews if my editor will basically read them first, and then she'll tell me, "Oh, this is a good one. You should read it," or "This is a good one. You should read it." I think in I think part of the reason that I do that is because I feel like by the time a critic is reading it, I've done all the work that I can do to it, right? There's nothing else that I can do to it. It's out in the world. So I because I know the type of person that I am, if I were to read negative feedback once the book is already out in the world, like, it's just not healthy for me at all. Um, because honestly, I think I struggle with confidence. I struggle with feeling like I'm doing my job well. I struggle you know, with, with sort of thinking that other people will think that what I am saying is worthwhile. And I think that part of the reason that I struggle with all of that is because, I was the type of I grew up in rural Mississippi. Um, I, uh, I was the type of kid who, because I was Black and because I was poor, and because I heard a lot about, I don't know, like, the worthlessness of people who are Black and poor, whenever I was in the classroom, I just felt like, oh, like, I don't have anything to contribute here, right? I mean, the only reason that I'm in this classroom is because of affirmative action, right? Like, I mean, and that wasn't coming from me. Like, I didn't come up with those conclusions. I think that I had internalized so much of the attitudes that I had encountered in the outside world, right? From uh, people who either overtly or covertly, had some white supremacist beliefs, right? And so I internalized a lot of that, and then that expressed itself in the classroom, right? I was the kid who sat in the back and who never talked. And this is from middle school to high school to undergrad and even into grad school. I didn't begin speaking in the classroom until the very end of my Stegner fellowship classes. And by then I was in my early 30s, right? So it took years and years to begin to unlearn some of that I had internalized. And so I guess uh I figured it out in the classroom, right? I moved past in the classroom, but I think there's still shadows of that, uh, that inferiority complex or that feeling like you don't deserve to be where you are. Um, but I think that some of that there's a residue of that that I still struggle with, especially when it comes to reviews and critics.
So how did you go about finding your voice then? If you weren't able to, if you weren't comfortable talking in classroom environments, how did you find your voice on the page? Was there
Yeah,
something that stimulated that?
yeah, no, well, I mean, that's what I did. I just worked it out on the page. So when I first began, of course, when I think back to the kind of stories that I wrote when I was in high school, first of all, I only wrote, I think I wrote like 2 stories in high school. And really they weren't stories because they were like extended scenes. They were terrible. Uh, Nothing happened, right? It was like a character sketch. But I didn't understand what a short story was, right? I was just like I was beginning to learn, right? And in all the fiction that I wrote in high school, there was no Black people. One of the stories was like a fantasy story, and the other story was a story about a cello player from Connecticut, and she was not Black. I've never even been to Connecticut. Well, I might have, and I might have gone like once now as an adult, but in high school, I'd never been to Connecticut before. So it's interesting to me that I guess I had internalized so much, right? That I thought, well, my stories aren't worth telling, right? Like stories about my experience or that are born from my experience or people that I know or the people that are around me, like those stories aren't worth telling. But these other stories are, right? That these other stories that don't center where I come from or who I am, right? Um, and then for my when I was applying to college, I wrote, like I guess kids still do this. Back in the day, we had to do this. We had to write like a longer personal
Yep.
statement, right? And I wrote about my hometown. Like I wrote about DeLille. I wrote about rural coastal Mississippi. I wrote about the kind of kids that I grew up with, like I wrote about, sort of what was happening for most of the young men who I knew, who grew up Black and poor in rural Mississippi and how some of them were, I don't know, like dabbling and selling drugs or were, pinning all of their hopes on sports, right? And what that looked like. Um, and then I wrote about you know, the most of the girls that I grew up with and sort of what they were struggling with and what their lives looked like. And um, and the response to that essay was like overwhelmingly positive. And and it made me think like, wait a second, maybe I could write about where I'm from and the kind of people I come from, the kind of people in my family and kind of people in my community. And maybe people will like maybe those stories, maybe people will respond well to those stories. Like maybe I do have something to say. And so then uh basically from then on, my stories were at least anchored in this place and in the people here. I didn't uh I was nowhere near the writer I am now back then, but I mean, the subject matter remained the same. The people who I wrote about in the place, that remained the same. Uh but I just, I wrote a short story and it was bad. And so I scrapped it and I tried again. And I wrote another short story and it was a little less bad. And then I did that again and again and again. Uh, and began to, and, of course, studied the craft of writing. And so that way began to find my way towards my voice.
Right. We've seen a very similar, or we've read a very similar process in Natalie Diaz's When My Brother Was an Aztec collection, because she is half Mexican, half Mojave, comes from sort of Native background, and a very similar situation there with the writing about the experience of the people who were living with and around her, which was really interesting. Those questions, just before I forget, came from Jamie Rambo in Georgia and Sabrina Burns in New Jersey. We've talked a little about Dalil and how it continues to influence your work. We have some very specific questions now about Sing and Buried Sing, if that's okay. The first of those comes from Dana DeFilippo in Florida. She says, Sing and Buried Sing makes use of multiple points of view. As an author, how do you decide whose voices need to serve as narrators, and how does that affect the development of the story?
Yeah, I mean, whoever, like, the narrators will determine the story, right? I mean, most of my narrators, most of my novels, most of my fiction is written from the first person perspective, right? So when you choose the narrator, you're determining, I guess, the vantage point that the story will be coming from. You're determining, who the person is that will be telling the story. You're determining, their history and all that they've experienced in their life and what their experiences will bring, to the narrative, and how their desires or wants or needs will then push the story forward, right, and make things happen. I I decide pretty early on, like, who will tell the story. In most of my novels, there's just one person telling the story. Sing and Bird Sing is the exception to that. Part of the reason it's an exception is because I was sort of challenging myself when I came up with the idea for Sing and Buried Sing. I mean, the first character who showed up was JoJo. JoJo was there from the very beginning. I was like, there's this kid that I want to write about. And this kid, like, I was just wondering about this kid and wondering what it would be like for him to grow up in the modern South, right? Like the modern Mississippi. What does that mean? What does that look like for a mixed race kid, who is mixed race, but who, when he moves through the world, he's just seen as Black, right? Like, what is life like for him, having to sort of navigate having this, like, neglectful mother, an absent father, right? And so he showed up first. So I knew for sure that certain, there would be a fair amount of chapters, like the book would be weighted towards his perspective, right? There would probably be more chapters from his perspective than any of the other characters. But then I thought, as I was, like, thinking about who are the other important characters who need to speak in, in this story, I thought, well, it has to be his mom, because his mom is she's such she's such an important figure in his life. Um, he struggles so much, uh, with her, with, like, his love for her, his hate for her, his sort of yearning for her to be a real caregiver for him. Um, she inspires a lot of complicated feelings in him. And so I thought, well, she needs to tell part of this story too. Because she's really important to him, and because I think I was interested in her story as well, because I was curious about who she was. Um, in the first, I would say, 12 drafts of Sing Unburied Sing, there were no chapters from the ghost's perspective, from Richie's perspective. I thought about I wanted actually to write chapters from his perspective when I began in the rough draft, like when I first began the book. But as I wrote my way into the rough draft, I think I was scared. I was like, if I write chapters from Richie the ghost's point of view, that's going to require me to do the kind of, I guess, work on the page of like world building and place setting uh, that I haven't had to do really, right? Because he's a ghost, right? So I have to construct an afterlife. I have to, there has to be a logic here. The
Right.
afterlife has to have texture. It has to seem as real as Bois Sauvage, right? And scared, I was like, I don't know if I can do that because that's not the kind of books that I write. So
Was there a different creative process to incorporating that sort of those sort of paranormal themes? Did it go a completely different road to writing the rest of the text?
well, yeah, I mean, I actually wrote Richie's chapters. I want to say I was probably 12 drafts in before I went back through the book and tried to figure out places where I could write Richie's chapters and put his chapters into the story and where they would feel organic to the
Mhm.
story. But if you look at Sing and Braid Sing, look at Richie's chapters, they're all short. And they're
Right.
short, because I was figuring out how to do them, and because I don't know, because it was difficult and because I think it was hard for me to sustain his voice, um, because I had to create a whole world around him. And and I just think that was hard for me to do. So that's why his chapters are shorter. I mean, I think that I like constructed his world enough. Like his world it's real enough.
Mhm.
But I don't know, but I wonder after writing Let Us Descend, where I spend so much more time, right, with the spirit, and where I create, that world has the spirit that the world that Annis, the spirit, I mean, the world that Aza, the spirit, lives in, it does have texture, like it does have, um, it has context. It seems real. It seems lived in. So I wonder what Richie's chapters, like how they would be different now, right? If I were to like write his chapters now. Um, yeah, I don't know.
Interesting. So that question about the paranormal themes came from Malali in Jersey, Alexander Lee in New York, and Alexander Tostred in Minnesota. And it sort of leads on to the next question, which is from Ethan Craig. And the question there really is: do you see all your writing as we move closer and closer to Let Us Descend? Is it a cumulative? That's the cumulative process of learning. Does everything sort of fall back in on itself, and then does everything that you've written before inspire what comes next?
I think so. Um, yeah, I think so. I think, if you look at all the books that I've written, uh, you could look at them one way and, my first book is my first book. My second book, I've learned a bit more. So I'm sort of fleshing out that world of Bois Sauvage in Salvage the Bones and then on with Sing Unburied Sing, right? Uh, but I think if you look at my work, like all my books just together, as I don't know, if you like look at the themes that I'm sort of obsessing over and struggling with and exploring in each book, that I think they're all connected, right? Because I'm writing a lot about grief, about relationships between parents and children or caregivers and children. I'm writing a lot about sibling relationships and how siblings come of age together and how they, I don't know, learn how to move through the world together. I'm writing a lot about children who are made to bear adult burdens before they should have to bear adult burdens, right? And how those children then survive that, and how if you look at my nonfiction, if you look at my memoir, right, how sometimes they don't survive that, right? So I don't know. I think that I'm exploring the same uh, ideas probably over and over in my work, but maybe my understanding of those ideas is becoming clearer. Maybe the the more books that I write, right, the more time that I spend with these characters, sort of thinking about where they are in their lives and how they're navigating their lives. But I don't know. I think they're all connected. I think if you're just looking at like a timeline, I think that my most recent book, Let Us Descend, which is about an enslaved young woman, I think that book would be at the beginning of the timeline. And I think
Okay.
that is connected to Where the Line Bleeds and Salvage the Bones and Sting and Buried Sing.
And do you think that connection comes from this idea of um, characters singing their stories? You know, sometimes they harmonize each other, sometimes they are sort of atonal, perhaps. But is that something that you constantly think about? How the characters will interact with each other within a novel and also potentially beyond that novel?
Hmm, that's a fantastic question, and I haven't thought about that. I haven't thought about it in that way before, right? Like the characters communicating with one another. I think I haven't thought about that. I mean, it's they're I feel like they're all hitting different notes, right?
Mhm.
They're all telling different stories, um, and having different experiences, but they're all anchored in this one place. So I don't know. So I guess it's in a way, it's almost like they're all part of a choir,
Right.
but they have different registers. You know what I'm saying? Like
Yeah.
um, they're giving voice to different aspects of the same space, the same location, I guess.
Yeah, that fantastic question was not mine at all. That came from Amy Gallagher in Pennsylvania and Catherine Ings in Indiana. But thank you for answering that. It was a very, very good question. And then another question. Then this is from Valerie Pearson in North Carolina and Catherine Kaufman in Maryland. Do you have any advice for people who want to try and start writing these potentially painful stories?
Uh, yes. I guess I would say know from the beginning that it's going to hurt. Um, I mean, when I think I really began to feel, I don't know, I think I felt that kind of, you know, the pain of sinking into the world with the characters and experiencing what they experience probably from my first book, right? My first book, Where the Line Bleeds, was about these twin boys who their mother has abandoned them basically. Their father is struggling with substance addiction. Um, and they're sort of they're at this crossroads, right? Where they graduate from high school and they're realizing how the world works, right? And that it's not exactly set up for them to succeed and to flourish, right? And um, and there's a kind of heartache in that. There's a kind of sort of tenderness in that I felt for them, right? Because I think it's hard to write about that reality. I don't know, with Salvage the Bones, right? Like those characters, Ash and her siblings, they'd lost their mother. Their father was also absent in a way, probably in alcohol, probably also dealing with substance abuse issues. Um, and and they had to take care of each other, and that's it. Um, and and it's painful to sit with that, right? Because as the writer, sometimes some days just wanted to save them, like I just wanted to write uh I wanted to turn away from the reality and write a happier ending, right? Or a happier book throughout, right? But that's not what I feel called to do, right? Like that's not I feel like because I'm choosing to write about the people that I write about, right? I have to be honest about the reality of their lives, right? One thing that I talk about a lot is this idea of like bearing witness, and that bearing witness to me is an act of love. And and some days it's easier to remember that than
Mhm.
other days, and I think that some days when you're writing about the hard stuff, you just have to cry, you know, especially like when I was working on my memoir, which is about five of my friends who died within 4 years. Well, four of my friends and cousins who died, and my brother who also died in over the course of 4 years, 4 to 5 years. There were days where I would just sit here, I would type, and I'm just doing this. I'm just like wiping tears away and typing. But I think that if you believe in the value of the story that you're telling, right? If you believe that telling this story and releasing this story, getting this story out in the world, that will do some good, that'll make, some kid who's reading it you know, out in the deserts of Arizona or, the Midwest somewhere in Michigan, right? That it'll make some kid who's reading it just feel a little less alone in the world because they're witnessing someone going through the same thing that they're going through, or they're witnessing the characters going through something that one of their friends is dealing with, or I think that then it's worth it. And then too, I think just because I'm a writer, it doesn't mean that I spend all of my free time, reading, William Faulkner and Toni Morrison and taking myself very seriously. And I mean, sometimes in order to write, show up in front of my computer and do the hard work, of writing about difficult things, like sometimes when I'm done, in order to sort of uh, cope, right? I'm watching TV. I'm listening to a podcast about aliens. I'm or I'm reading a romance novel. Like I'm, like I do whatever outside of the hours that I work. I think whatever I feel like I need to do. I do things that give me joy, right? To remind myself, right? That at the same time, yes, that I'm, engaging with these really hard facts and hard ideas and on the page, but there's joy still, there's hope still, there's silliness still, right? And I think that's important because even when you write about hard things on the page, I feel like um unless you're writing horror, like if you're writing in any other genre, there should be some joy on the page. There should be some silliness on the page. There should be some hope on the page, right? There because that's true to life, I feel like.
Yeah, absolutely. And we have another question that sort of follows along from that quite nicely.
Mhm.
This is from Julissa Rodriguez Ayala in South Carolina. She says, as an aspiring Latin writer who wants to write about adolescent characters who struggle with their cultural identities and generational trauma and poverty, I often worry that I'm leaning too heavily into stereotypes. How do you use or avoid stereotypes in your work?
Mhm. That is another great question. I mean, I think, of course, right, that stereotypes exist outside of the work, right? When I especially when I was working on my first novel, where my first novel is about, these young Black boys growing up in rural Mississippi. Two of them are, uh, sort of selling drugs, right? Like, I was worried too. I was like, "Oh my god," like, I'm affirming stereotypes, by writing about these characters. Then I thought about it and I was like, "Well, it's not I'm not inventing the circumstances of their lives, right?" Um, I looked at my friends, I looked at my cousins who I grew up with. There were plenty of them who were young Black males who who did the same, right, throughout their lives. Um, and they did it, they had multiple reasons for doing it, right? So I was like, well, I'm not inventing the circumstance, right? That I guess on the surface seems to confirm the stereotype, right? However, what I can do, because I'm choosing to write about kids like this, right, people who are struggling with these what could be sort of stereotypical issues, is I'm going to make these kids, these boys, as complicated as I can make them, right? They're they're not sort of struggling with selling drugs because um because they like flashy, I don't know, cars, because they just want money so they can ball out. Like, they're doing it because they want to take care of their grandmother. They're doing it because she's disabled and they're thinking about, sort of the rest of her life and what they might have to do to provide for her. They're doing it because they've been abandoned by their parents in some respect, right? So they really don't have good models, right? To help them, to be models for how they should move through the world. They don't have anybody that they can go to who could, like, help them in practical ways to figure out other ways to move through the world, right? Like, um, they don't know anybody who's gone to college. They don't know anybody who can help them, figure their way out through that process to get in, like, to get into school, right? So anyhow, I just try to make the characters as complicated and as complex as I can, right? Because what I want to do is I want to reflect some of the complexity and some of the complicatedness, I guess, of real life, right?
Yeah.
In the characters' experiences. And I think if you do that, like, if the characters live on the page in that way, and if the world is real on the page in that way, then you can't stereotype them, right?
Yeah.
Because they're just people. They're just people doing the best they can with what they have.
So yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned they're going to college and things like that. Do you have any advice for students who might be looking considering going to study creative writing at university, either as an undergraduate or as a graduate student? Is there anything that you say this is one thing that you definitely should take into consideration if you're going to
Mhm.
do that?
I so that you might not like the first my first bit of advice, but I wish that someone had given me this advice when I was younger, just because I think it would have made that transition from college to being a working adult. Like, I think that it would have made that transition a little bit easier. And so if I had it to do it all again, um, I would, at the same time that I would have studied creative writing, right? Um, and really like availed myself of the resources of the university, right? And taken lots of classes and done a lot more writing, which I didn't. I only took like 3 creative writing classes when I was an undergrad, again, because I was just sort of struggling with my confidence, right? And feeling like I didn't even deserve to be in the classroom. I would have also tried to study something practical at the same time that I studied what I loved, right? So I would have tried to study something that had practical applications out in the real world, so that, and whether that would have been in healthcare, whether that would have been, I don't know, just something practical, studying something practical at the same time that I followed my passion. Just because I think, like when I graduated, I couldn't find a job like for like a year. After I graduated, I was living off credit cards, racked up a lot of debt. Um, Ended up my first job after I graduated from university, when I had a bachelor's degree and a master's degree, was working at a Tommy Hilfiger store in an outlet mall. You know what I'm saying? Like that, and I feel like if I would have studied something that was like practical at the same time that I studied, English and creative writing, then that just would have made that transition a bit easier. The second thing, but then again, I say that, but I don't know what my life would look like now if I had done that. Maybe I would have gotten maybe I would have been more comfortable, and that would have made me defer my dreams, and I wouldn't have been 23 and deciding to commit myself to writing, right? Or 25, right? Or however old I was. I think I was 24, 23, 24. Maybe I would have been 35 by the time I finally decided, oh, I wanna write, right? Like I wanna really do my best at this and try and learn and and start producing work. But I don't know, but I think it's useful to think about, right?
Right.
And the second thing that I would tell young creative writers, who are interested in studying creative writing and becoming, working publishing writers, is that this industry, and you'll hear this from everyone, like most of your, if you study creative writing, you'll hear this from your creative writing instructors. But this it's a hard industry because people will constantly reject you. Agents will reject you, editors will reject you, both editors at publishing companies, editors at magazines, literary magazines, newspapers. You will People will continuously reject you, right? Um, but and that's true. That was true for me. That's true for nearly every writer I know, right? What but what you have to remember is that hundreds of people can reject you, right? Your job as a writer is to continue to write, continue to do the work on the page in the classroom to be the best writer that you can be, right? So and you have to continuously put yourself out there and just get the rejection, get the rejection, right? Um, but you have to continuously put yourself out there so that one day you find that one person who is going to say yes, who's going to read your work, understand what you're trying to do. Your work may not be perfect, but they will see beauty in it, and they'll know how to help you to improve it, to make it so that it can become what it wants to be and what you want it to be, right? You have to find that one person. So, so hundreds of people can tell you no, thousands of people can tell you no, but you have to stick with it until you can find that one person who will tell you yes. And then you'll get 100 more people telling you no. But then that one yes will lead to someone else telling you yes, right? And that's how you build a career.
Yeah, That's brilliant advice. Thank you. That's really meaningful. I think the students will be glad to hear that, Jesmyn. I think they really will. We're down to our last few questions, our last two questions, actually. Next one is this is from Rena Gayo in New Jersey. She says, you are a two-time National Book Award winner, which is an amazing accomplishment. What did those awards mean to you? Did they have any impact on your creative journey?
Those awards mean everything to me because, you don't when you decide when you commit to writing, right? When you commit to stories, and you say, "Okay, this is what I wanna do." Then when you sit down and you start doing the work day in and day out, you're not thinking about the you're not thinking about the awards, right? Like, um, in part because so many writers are producing books and telling stories that are worthy of awards, right? The quality of the work is so great, right? That that I think one thing that you understand sort of pretty quickly is that some of it is just due to luck, right? Like, I don't know. I mean, yes, you are producing good work, but sometimes you just get lucky, right? Um, so I don't know. I mean, I never expected that kind of success for myself. Um, when I was first starting out, I never thought that, you know, I would be considered for and or nominated for one of those things. Um, but I appreciate them because I think that because I write about what I write about, that it's harder to get an audience for my work. Um, yeah, it's harder to get an audience for my work. And that was true, especially true when my first book was published, right? When I when I sold when me and my agent, my first agent, when we sold my first book, I mean, we bought it out to, I don't know, like a dozen different publishing companies. And what we kept hearing, like the subtext of what we kept hearing, and this was back in the sort of early 2000s, like 2008, 7, 2008, was that they just didn't think that there was an audience for my work, right? Because I was writing about poor Black people from the South, right? And so there was this assumption that, it's not, no one's going to want to read this, right? Um, and I know that winning a prestigious, you know, award like the National Book Award, that changed everything for me because that um, I think signaled to the industry, that there's worth here, right? There's beauty in these stories, right? That resonates, I guess beyond color and class and all of those things, right? Gender, all of those things. Um, so yeah, so I'm very grateful for those awards and I know that I would not be where I am today uh, without them. Honestly, I don't even know. I don't know. I mean, I think that I would still tell stories because I have to, right? It's a part of me. It's what I love to do. But I don't know. I just think that my life right now would look very different um, if if I hadn't done the work, but also gotten really lucky right, twice and been awarded those prizes.
Right. And last question, we're at the end almost. Tisha Salopa from Missouri says, do you have any upcoming plans or any new paths about which you're excited? What can we expect from you soon?
So I am under contract to write a YA book. I thought so I've been talking about it and I've been saying, oh, I'm going to write a middle grade / YA book. But recently I just realized that I'm probably actually writing like a younger YA book, right? Because I guess YA starts at like age 12, right? And that's probably the age that I'm probably focusing the book towards, right? Readers who are 12, 13, 14. Um, uh, maybe some advanced 10 and 11-year-olds, probably. So yeah, so that's what I am working on right now. I have no idea what I'm doing. I'm attempting to read YA and middle grade books to try to help me figure out what I'm doing. But yeah, but I think that is what will come out next. Either that or I have an essay collection of my essays, right? Because I've written a fair amount, for Time, Vanity Fair, for Oxford American, just, I don't know, like I've written a lot. So yeah, so I have an essay collection coming out, but I don't know exactly when. That book is actually mostly done, but I just think that maybe my publisher might want to put out the YA book first before the essay collection, or not. But those are the two projects that I'm working on right now.
Excellent. So very, very different projects to what we've
Yes,
seen before.
very different. Very different projects.
Excellent.
Yeah.
We look forward to seeing them both and reading them both, Jesmyn. So thank you so much for your time. We really, really appreciate it. And thank you for all the advice and the responses to our students' questions. They will really appreciate those as well. So yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
So there we have it. Thank you all very much for your attendance this evening and for sending your questions for the interview. If you would like to watch the interview again, it will be made available on the Sigma Tau Delta and NEHS YouTube channel. You can find that at Sigma Tau Delta English on YouTube. If you click the bell to subscribe, you will receive updates and interesting video content from us in the future as well. I'd like to remind NEHS student members about the NEHS scholarship competition. If you want to apply, you need to start reading Kazuo Shigeru's Clara and the Sun right now. If you need any help or have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. That's all for now, but we'll be in touch, and we hope to see you at our next webinar with Kimberly Chambers' Kickstart Prize for Underrepresented Writers winner, Anissa Marufu, on November 13th. Sorry, November 13th. Good night.